My name is David Toy. I am the Programme Manager of the St Andrews Forest. I love this graphic. It's a great visual metaphor for the forest. It started out with some enthusiastic students saying, this is what we'd like to do, and we added the trees. I also like to start by saying that the St Andrews Forest is perhaps the worst named programme in the entire university, given that it's actually not about trees, not really. And it's also not about the town of St Andrews. But my proposed alternative of the University of St Andrews global nature-based carbon offsetting programme didn't get as many votes. So the St Andrews Forest is what we went with. Today I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and then I'll take questions afterwards. I'm going to talk about carbon, nature and people. That's a bit of a refrain for me. And I'm going to dive into quite a shallow level this very ambitious and challenging project. But before we get into it, let's start with the genesis story of the forest. In about 2018, in 2018, Greta had her first school strike for climate. In 2019, this inspired our Line in the Sand event, pictured here on two of the covers of these documents. 1,200 people taking 5 minutes in silence to reflect on humankind's impact on the planet. That led to, in about 2020, the formation of our Environmental and Sustainability Board at the university. And the ESB proposed our sustainability strategy and first set our vision of being carbon net zero by 2035. The ESB is made up of students, staff, academic and delivery. And one of the students on that ESB at that point in time put forward a proposal. And I'm paraphrasing here, that basically the proposal said, as a global educational institution, or as an educational institute of global renown, we are always going to attract people from all over the world to study here. And those people getting here have emissions from travel. Those are unavoidable. They're always going to be part of the makeup of what it is for St Andrews to be St Andrews. And the question was asked, could the university create a forest to offset those ongoing, unavoidable emissions from travel? Obviously, the answer to that was yes, otherwise none of us would be here talking about the forest today. And the latest document here is our next 5-year strategy, which was launched at the tail end of last year. And personally, I am so excited that sustainability is a top-level theme within that strategy. It's the first time that sustainability has been that high. I want to go back and talk briefly about net zero by 2035, and I'm going to take you through this slide. As a university, we had to do an exercise, and I say we, it's the royal we, there's a great number of other staff members that are involved in this. The exercise to look at what is our carbon footprint, what is in and what is out, what is our responsibility. And St Andrews has said that actually it's not just the emissions from our energy that count towards our carbon footprint, but the emissions that occur because the University of St Andrews does what it does. So that includes things like the embodied carbon in the chairs and the tables that you're currently sitting at. It includes the embodied carbon in the buildings that we build to do what we do. And it includes the carbon present in travelling to and from the university. There are some universities that haven't included that travel portion in their calculations. We have. And we've also said that we're doing 2 return trips a year, because that kind of feels about right. Whereas some other universities that haven't included travel are just saying, oh, that's coming at the start of the first semester or first term and leaving at the end of the last one. So for 2019-2020, before the pandemic changed all the numbers, our carbon footprint was about 73,000 tonnes a year. For 2035, with a great deal of effort and some significant investment, we reckon that we can shave off about 33,000 tonnes from that number, indicated by the blue dotted area in the second bar. But that still leaves about 40,000 tonnes of residual emissions, which in order for us to be net zero, we will have to balance by offsetting. And so the challenge for the St Andrews Forest is to offset 20,000 tonnes of carbon every year. And if that sounds like a big number, it's because it is. And in tree terms, 2035 isn't that far away. So that's the carbon challenge that the St Andrews Forest is seeking to address. But carbon is only one of the themes of the forest. We are a teaching and research institution, and so whatever we do with these projects, we would hope to be able to use them for teaching and research. And we're also, as a species, beginning to realize that biodiversity is by and large a really good thing. It's a really good thing because, broadly speaking, when you increase biodiversity in an ecosystem, you increase the carbon sequestration, but the reverse is not necessarily true. Biodiversity is also a great thing because when you have a greater amount of biodiversity in an ecosystem, you have a greater deal of built-in resilience to change, including things like climate change. So the forest has three themes: carbon, nature, and people. And there are other reasons to do woodlands and other nature-based projects, and they're listed here. This is the vision: a global tapestry of woodland and other nature-based projects for carbon, for nature, and for people. Why? Why are we doing this? Why are we thinking about net zero? Why do we want to do this by 2035? And the top reason is that we've got the targets set by the Paris Agreement. And those targets are set not to protect the biodiversity, but to protect our ability as humans to live on planet Earth. So they're good targets to try and meet. And then that rolls into our 2035 target. But it also rolls into, and this was the most difficult one when my boss originally told me about it, think about the next 600 years of the University of St Andrews. Because the forest will be around for that amount of time, whether it's trees or salt marsh or peatland or whatever the nature-based solution is. We're looking at long-term permanent land use change. Now, borrowing from tree planting. In tree planting, you want the right tree in the right place, planted at the right time. In this program, it's about getting the right mix of projects in the right place, for the right reason, implemented by the right people. So, it's quite complex. Oops. Some pictures to show you what we've been doing so far. Broadly speaking, while I'm saying that it's not just about trees, everything we've done so far has been about trees, so forgive me on that one. Through our own initiatives and working with community organisations like Footprint East Neuk, we have been able to do local tree planting events. We've also had landowner partners come forward and say, I've created a new woodland, I'd love for this to be part of St Andrews Forest. There's a couple of other pictures I'll draw attention to. In the middle row, the brown earth picture, that's a team of volunteers planting about 9,000 trees at our Guardbridge Eden campus back in March this year. The bottom row, the green picture, that's the same site from a slightly different angle a couple of months later. So there's a miniature forest that's been created in our land, and we've done the same at Sports, and we've done the same with at least four different landowner partner sites around St Andrews. But the guy in the middle in the orange tabard is probably the most interesting to talk about, and that's why we're here today. I was invited to speak today because of a blog post that's on the Energy Cafe website, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it to you. It talks about a recent student project where students were asked, how will we know if these projects in the St Andrews Forest programme are working? How will we know if we're actually sequestering carbon, if we're actually delivering benefit for nature and delivering benefit for people? And it's a really tough question to ask. The guy in the Orange Tower is flying a drone over one of our sites to create a baseline survey of what's there at the very beginning of that site being part of the St Andrews Forest. And in the top corner, I must remember, the top corner with a video of the principal is a crowdfunding platform. So if you want to donate to the St Andrews Forest and help make it happen, that's an option. And for any staff here or viewing, there's also an option to do salary sacrifice if you wish to give through salary giving. And there's more information about that on the Forest website. A small map showing the sites so far. Now, this map stands at odds with the vision that I articulated earlier of a global project. But there is reason for this. We've started locally and small for pragmatic and philosophical reasons. Pragmatic in that it's easy to get out and touch a tree or any other project that's in the St Andrews Forest when they're nearby to the university. And for well-being, for teaching and research, there's a whole bunch of advantages. It also was easy to do because we can work with our existing partners and networks. But the philosophical one is we're starting in Scotland because we believe in solving this problem in our own backyard first, before we look globally to solve it elsewhere. So, we're building momentum. We've done miniature forests, we're working with landowners, and I am currently talking to some very interesting partners who I hope to do projects with at landscape scale. So small miniature forests are really good for accessibility, but for actual impact, you can't beat something that's the size of the side of a hillside in Scotland. And that's the challenge that I'm now working on with partners. And this will build a positive, self-fulfilling cycle. Now, tree planting or any other nature-based solution is one part of the work streams in the St Andrews Forest. It is perhaps my part of the forest, because the forest is such a large project that I can't hand on heart say that it's my project. It is our project. This is the university project. The bit that I've been working on are the projects and how we fund these things. But actually, the scope of the forest and the tie-in to every other department is much greater. At the moment in the UK, we have options that are woodlands and peatlands. And that's because really good frameworks exist that show that the intervention on the ground translates into an actual carbon benefit. But we could also be doing projects with salt marshes. We could also be doing projects with regenerative agriculture. We could be doing projects with soil carbon capture. We could be doing projects with hedges, which sort of don't quite fit within the existing woodland carbon code. But there hasn't been enough science done to back up any assumptions in those frameworks about how the intervention on the ground translates into an actual carbon benefit. Fortunately, we're an academic institution, so we can help there, and that's part of the forest scope. The carbon accounting is, I hasten to add that this is much broader than just the forest, but when you buy a packet of crisps now, on the back of the packet of crisps, it will say something like 35 grams of CO2 were emitted in producing this packet of crisps. The challenge I ask, hypothetically, is how do we print on the back of every student's degree certificate, this is the carbon footprint of your education at St Andrews. Now, we could just take our 73,000 tonnes and divide it by the number of students that come through here a year, but I don't think that's going to wash. I don't think that's nearly detailed enough. But the moment that you start going any more detailed than that, you need to say, well, this is the cohort that was in this class, that was in this school this year. And that cohort used this lecture room, which uses this amount of energy per hour, 5 times, and they went on a field trip to such and such a place, and the carbon embodied in that field trip was, I think you get the point. There's a level of granularity of carbon understanding that we need to have, and if we're working so hard to either mitigate our emissions or offset our emissions, we should also be aware internally where those emissions are generated. And the degree certificate is only a thought experiment to show how difficult it would be. And the final piece of work within the forest is, when we're doing all of this, how do we then inspire others to do more themselves? And that might be just leading by example. Or it might be that we can take everything that we're learning from this project and lead on policy discussions, both in the UK and internationally. And that would be really exciting. Now, the other line at the bottom of this slide is perhaps the most important of all. The Forest has an academic network which seeks to tie the best practice understanding in research to delivery of the forest, and the lessons learned from delivery back into academic research. Yes. And the Forest also exists to work with anybody that sees that it's relevant to what they're doing. So if you are looking for a project, or if you think, I think I've got a project here that kind of ties in with that, please come and talk to me. Forest@ is the easiest email to address to remember. And we'll have a conversation about it. Now, I'd like to chat very briefly about delivery. In this presentation already, I have mentioned carbon sequestration and carbon offsetting. But I ask, what is the difference between the two? Because I have spoken to a couple of people who thought one was the other. And to do this job, I need to be quite clear about what's sequestration, what's offsetting. Here are two hypothetical projects in Scotland. One is a peatland restoration project on the left, and one is a new woodland project on the right. Please forgive me for using a picture of a mature woodland in talking about a new woodland, but it makes for a far prettier slide. Both of these hypothetical projects are offsetting projects, but only one of them is a carbon sequestration project. Trees take carbon out of the atmosphere. Peatlands are a historical store of carbon from millennia, so long as you keep them wet. But it turns out that for a variety of things that we thought were best practice at the time, we haven't always done that. And damaged peatlands are emitting carbon dioxide to an extent that they might be as much as 15% of Scotland's total greenhouse gas emissions. The good news is that it's actually really easy. Give me a pinch on how easy it is to restore peatlands by re-wetting them, by changing the drainage profile, by changing the profile of the landscape, and by transplanting some of the plants so that they recover the peat and keep it moist and underground. So these are two types of projects that we're looking at landscape scale. Both of them are carbon offsetting projects. Carbon offsetting, the wordy slide is deliberate. Carbon offsetting is a transaction. It is a legal transfer of something that you cannot see and cannot hold between organizations. It is the equivalent of us mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. And in order for it to be classed as a carbon offset, there are some fairly high standards that have to be met. It has to be additional, so in terms of woodlands, it can't be woodlands that already exist, it can't be woodlands that would have been created anyway, it can't be woodlands that are being created to displace other activity like a new power line, new railway, new wind turbines. They don't count. It has to be new for woodlands. My shorthand for this is if it involves workers in muddy boots, that's probably carbon sequestration. And if it involves lawyers in smart suits, that's probably carbon offsetting. Now, last week in The Guardian, there was an article that showed that one of the largest carbon credit organizations in the world has a problem. And the problem is that after 2 bits of academic research, it's possible that 90% of the carbon credits issued under that scheme are worthless and should never have been issued. Now, it's fortunate that we haven't done anything with that scheme as part of the St Andrews Forest. And in the UK, the two standards that we have in the UK, in the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code, require a far higher standard to ensure that what we say has happened has actually happened. And they are mature standards. You know, it's the Woodland Carbon Code is now at version 2.2. It reached version 2 in 2018 after about a decade, and there hasn't been that much change of it since. And the Peatland Carbon Code is very similar to the Woodland Carbon Code. So I'm going to touch on how the Woodland Carbon Code works because it explains the mechanisms and some of the challenge that we will have. So I've borrowed this graphic from another organisation. Thank you very much. And this is roughly how it works. At the start of the project, in the validation phase, an estimate is made as to how much carbon a new woodland will sequester across its lifetime, or how much carbon will be saved by restoring the peatland and stopping it emitting. And that's shown by the ghost tree. At that point in time, the university, as emitter who wishes to offset, would buy effectively IOUs. They're called pending issuance units. They will become carbon credits, but they are not carbon credits at the point that we would buy them. Then at year 5, year 15, and every 10 years after that, an independent assessor would go out to the projects that we've invested in and verify that the trees have grown as much as expected, or that the peatland has been restored to an acceptable standard and that standard is being maintained. And that would continue every 10 years until the end of the project. The challenge is that these projects can easily be 85 or 100 years long. I have a young child that's under 1 year old. These projects will outlive her. So she will maybe matriculate here in 20 years' time, and the projects will roll on, she will graduate and then go through her life, and then the projects will continue. And that is the time scale that we're talking about with nature-based solutions. You'll also see that when it comes to woodlands, woodlands have kind of adolescence, year 15 through to year 25. And before that, there's not much carbon sequestered as they begin to grow, but as they go through that adolescence and then into later life, the carbon sequestration is much higher. Those of you that are following along with the maths will realize that 2035 is only about 13 years away. So while these nature-based solutions will become a strategic portfolio for the university, they are only part of our solution in the St Andrews Forest, and that is only part of our solution to our net zero 2035 ambition. I mentioned carbon nature people, I will return to it. Over that timescale of project, we don't really have any levers to pull to compel the generations that come after us to do what we would like them to do. We can guide them, we can hope that they do the right thing, but we can't force people to look after these projects. So the only way to guarantee that these projects will survive in the long term is to ensure that, regardless of whether this context is Scotland or global, that the project continue to be useful to the communities that live and work around them, whether that's some sort of economic advantage or whether it just helps an additional crop grow. Because when they continue to be useful, they will be kept. And in being kept, the benefit to nature will also be maintained, and the carbon stored in those projects will also be retained. And before I close, I'll just show some examples of how things change in 120 years, not necessarily the next 600 years of university standards. The map on the left is courtesy of the National Library of Scotland, and it shows St Andrews about 1900. The map on the right is a more modern Ordnance Survey map, and the two ringed areas are identical on both maps. So basically, if you've ever been in the buildings that are DRA, Fife Park, the Sports Centre, Andrew Melville Hall, well, none of that existed 120 years ago. Yet that's the timescale we're thinking about these projects. Off to the left of this map, to the west, is Strathkinnis. Same idea, but this time I've circled the woodlands. And you can see that over that time period, there are some woodlands that have completely disappeared from the map. Unfortunately, there are some woodlands that have been added. So, having said it's not really about trees, we run regular local tree planting events. And if you'd like more information about them, scan the QR code and sign up to the newsletter. That's the best way of finding out about it. I am hugely privileged to do the job that I do. It's very rare that an organisation takes such a long-term view of a problem. You know, if you think about organisations that actually think about the next 600 years, it's basically prestigious universities and religions, and that's it. So to be able to stand here today and say, I am one of the blessed people who aims to plant trees in whose shade I will never sit. It's not my idea, that goes back to Cicero. I'm very fortunate to do this job. Today, I have covered only a fraction of the detail of what's actually involved in implementation of the St Andrews Forest. And part of that is because we're still at some fairly commercially sensitive stages with partners. I'm really excited to be talking to the people that we're talking to, because partnerships have a potential to unlock not only the carbon nature people thing, but a lot of other advantages for the university. So that's a really exciting thing, and I'd love to be able to share more about it, but I won't today. I hope you understand. And I open the floor to any questions that you might have.